Alrighty, so today's collector is, I have to say, somewhat infamous here at the Tennessee Herbarium. Our students got very familiar with his specimens when we were imaging our bryophyte collection. And they're fairly distinctive. So they're all packaged like this with very little information. You can see usually just a scientific name, and then Herb J. Zodda, purchased by UT 1948, stamped on them. But inside, each of them is usually a small folded packet, often like this, that has to be photographed and then unfolded to photograph inside. And sometimes there's a smaller packet inside of that packet to photograph and unfold and photograph inside. Sometimes there are additional notes on tiny pieces of paper. Sometimes there are two packets inside with the same information, or sometimes they have different information on them. So it's much more of a lengthy process to image these specimens. And students quickly learn if you get a folder full of sheets of Zodda specimens, it's going to take you a while longer than a normal folder. And so even though we have finished imaging our bryophytes, Zodda looms still quite large because his specimens, as you can see, are also handwritten. He uses a mixture of Italian and Latin, and Zodda's handwriting is, as you can see, quite challenging to read. So we have a significant backlog of records from his collection that are waiting to be transcribed. And I've actually been slowly working my way through some of them over the last few weeks. So I thought it would be fitting to share what I could find of his story today. And I've picked out just one example, which again has not much detail on the outside. Looking at the internal packet, which I'll go ahead and zoom in on, and you can see it was collected by Zodda. And this is VI 906, which is an abbreviation for June of 1906. He writes his dates in a few different formats, but this is probably the most common, and it also gives students trouble. It was collected ad muros, which means on walls in Latin, at Castelmola. And Castelmola is a town on the coast of the island of Sicily in the province of Messina. So the specimen itself is identified as Tortula muralis variety incana, which is commonly known as wall screw moss. It's a cosmopolitan moss, so that means it is found all around the world. It commonly grows in urban areas on substrates like concrete, cement, and brick walls, as well as on rocks and less frequently on trees. One cool feature that I thought is it has a twisted peristome on top of its sporophytes, which I assume is what inspired its common name. So J. Zodda was Giuseppe Zodda, which is a little confusing. You'll actually see J. Zodda stamped on all of our specimens and at least one of his publications, but on most of his actual handwritten labels, he writes G. Zodda or just Zodda. He was an Italian botanist and bryologist born in 1877 in Meri, which is another town in the province of Messina. He attended the University of Messina studying natural sciences and graduated with honors in 1899. His thesis was on the geobotany and vegetation of Messina. The following year, he was appointed assistant in charge of the chair of botany at the university, and he would work in association with the herbarium at the university's botanic gardens for the next 8 years. It's said that he quickly gained an interest in mosses and specialized in their systematics. And most of the specimens we have here in our collection at Tennessee were collected while he was working there. We actually have close to 1,300 from that time, all from locations, almost all from locations throughout that province of Messina, and a couple from nearby Catania. So this work continued until the end of 1908, when an immense earthquake struck the city of Messina. The earthquake occurred on December 28th and was 7.1 in magnitude. The epicenter was in the Strait of Messina, so between the island of Sicily and mainland Italy. 91% of the structures were destroyed in Messina, and an estimated 75,000 people were killed. The city of Reggio de Calabria, which is on the mainland, also suffered severe damage, and another 25,000 people were believed to have died. The quake struck at 5:20 a.m., so most people were sleeping when their structures started to collapse. A 12-meter, which is 39 feet high, tsunami was triggered 10 minutes after the quake, causing even more destruction and killing an estimated 20,000 more people. So based on damage and casualties, it was the most destructive earthquake to ever strike Europe. Messina lost close to half of its population. Large sections of the coast actually sank into the sea. So the city was rebuilt on the rubble, but many citizens moved away to other parts of Sicily and to mainland Italy. And Messina is sometimes called the city without memory due to its lack of historic buildings as a direct result of this earthquake and additional losses in World War II. So a really tragic event in that area's history. And Zodda was there. He miraculously survived the disaster, but the university's botanic garden and its herbarium were severely damaged. So you may have wondered why Zodda looks a little unhappy in this particular photo, and it might make more sense if I show you the entire picture. So this is a picture of him surveying the herbarium after the quake. A note on the back says, "Cabinet of the Botanical Garden of Messina, ruined by the earthquake of December 28th, 1908. The work tables on the wall have been cleared of rubble. On the right, Dr. Giuseppe Zodda, and on the left, the gardener, D'Agostino Giuseppe." So a pretty awful way to have your work disrupted. Initially, after the quake, Zodda moved to work at the Botanical Institute of Catania, but he didn't stay there very, very long. He returned to Messina in 1909 to teach at the Technical School and Technical Institute. And while there, he actually also studied the effects of the earthquake on the surrounding flora and published a report on that subject later that year. Zodda then left Sicily and dedicated himself primarily to teaching middle school, working in several locations across the mainland of Italy, including Mantua, Naples, Bari, and Teramo. We actually have only one moss specimen that he collected after 1909. But that didn't end his bryological work entirely. He continued to study mosses and liverworts in his spare time. In 1934, at the request of the Italian Botanical Society, he wrote a volume on liverworts as part of the Flora Italica Cryptogamma. And in that introduction, he writes that Italy did not yet possess a complete work, which could also serve as a basis for anyone who had the courage to study the liverworts. He also says that the undertaking was difficult, for me especially. My duties as a middle school teacher leave me no breathing room, so to speak, so much so that I had to steal spare time when I had the chance. So this work was interrupted and restarted several times, but that in the meantime, I hope these pages of mine, written at intervals, but always with great love, will be received by Italian bryology scholars and can serve as an incentive and guide to the study of these small, indeed quite tiny, or indeed often tiny and yet graceful plants. So he also described a number of new bryophyte and vascular taxa during his years in education. Zodda finished his teaching career in Teramo in central Italy, and he remained there after retiring in 1947. So based on our stamps, the following year is when he sold his herbarium collection of mosses and liverworts to the University of Tennessee. I didn't have time to do much digging to see if maybe we had some records associated with that sale, but I think it'd be really interesting to know how and kind of why it ended up over here, if he had connections to any of the herbarium staff or faculty, but I really can't say at this point. His collection includes not just specimens that he collected, but a lot from other collectors, many specimens that Zodda identified, many of them fellow Italians. We have a lot from, or that Renato Pampanini collected in the Veneto region in northern Italy, and a lot from Leopoldo Nicotra in Sicily, and Nicotra was actually the director of Messina's botanical gardens, and a lot of other names, which you can see that we had to attempt to decipher from his lovely handwriting. So Zodda continued to work in botany after his retirement, publishing a 3-volume flora for the Teramo province in the 1950s, and at least one work in 1962 when he was 85. And he passed away in May of 1968 at the age of 91. So in Tropicos, Zodda's name is associated with 59 taxon names, mostly bryophytes. And the International Plant Names Index shows 3 vascular plants that he described. There is 1 genus of algae named in his honor, and at least 4 species or varieties of bryophytes that I could find. Specimen-wise, there are about 1,500 in the bryophyte portal, 1 in the lichen portal, 10 in vascular cernic portal, and I found 1,800 in GBIF. Interestingly, out of the 1,800 in GBIF, over 1,400 of those specimens are here at the Tennessee Herbarium. And the next largest, if you look from an herbarium in Pisa, which has 128. So, and I should say these are the numbers that are digitized and linked on GBIF. So I'm assuming that there are more in other herbaria that have specimens, but it's cool, I think, that we have such a large portion of his work and that this project is making them accessible to people back in Italy and around the world. So that is Giuseppe Zodda, botanist, bryologist, teacher, earthquake survivor, and an important contributor to the bryophyte collection here at the UTK Herbarium. And hopefully we will continue to decipher his handwriting and get the rest of his collections databased and online. So thank you again for listening.